So why is PL SQL a programming language? Why do I keep calling it a programming language? Because it has a block or modular-like structure, which means it allows you to pass things between blocks, up and down hierarchical structures, however you've got it organized. Your coding, that is. Exception trapping is very important in programming languages, especially modular programming languages, and also object languages, actually, because what it does is says, when you have an error situation, you try to do something that the computer is going to crash with, you have to handle that error. So it pops out to a special chunk of code that says, go and handle this error. Send a message to the user, say, don't do that. Or send a message in the extreme, if you don't trap an exception, what will happen is that PL SQL will pass the error up to the calling piece of code, or the calling program, which could actually be the Oracle database, the SQL engine, or even SQL+, and it will send an error to SQL+ and tell you, you can't drop that key now because it has subsidiary elements that are dependent on it, such as primary and foreign keys. That's an exception occurring. How is PL SQL modular? Because it has things called procedures and functions and triggers and packages and parameters. Anonymous procedures, named procedures, functions, and triggers are actually all the same thing. Kind of, it's a chunk of code. It goes from a begin statement to an end, and the stuff in between does all sorts of things, whatever you want it to do. They have minor differences. Well, they have minor differences there, have different functions. An anonymous procedure does not have a name, so it's not stored into the database, so it just basically does something and does it once. A named procedure is stored in the database, so you take the code, write it, create it, test it, make sure it's all happy and hunky-dory, store it in the database, then 10 years later you can come along and execute that procedure again, or 5 minutes later. You store it, you don't have to write it again. A function is like a procedure except that it will return a value, so it is an expression. A procedure does not return a value. There are ways to return things with procedures, but that's a little bit more complicated. Essentially, a procedure stores a chunk of code, allows you to execute it again later. A function stores a chunk of code as a named function and allows you to execute it again later, but also returns a value. A trigger is slightly different. It's just like a procedure or a function, except it doesn't have parameters. It is executed internally by Oracle when an event occurs in the database, such as an insert statement, an update statement, a delete, and so on and so forth. Typically, when you change data in the database, you say, well, tie this trigger to that insert event on that table, and that trigger will execute and goes off and does some other code. You've got to be careful with triggers because you can get into a big coding knot with multiple layered hierarchical structured triggers, things, lots and lots of them basically. You can get into a big mess. A package is simply a block of code that is used to take a bunch of named procedures and functions that probably would be related, but they don't have to be, and you're going to store them into that package, which means you compile that package all as one unit, and you can actually store it in the database as one unit and execute it and pin it into memory to make it go faster as a single unit. A package is probably began as more of a programming tool than anything else, but it has become a few other things along with basically pinning in memory. A parameter is a thing that's passed into a function, and a procedure, a named procedure and a named function, that can change the way that the code inside the procedure or the function executes. It's a value, pass something into the procedure that says go read something or do something slightly differently, execute a different kind of code or a different section of code. So, a data type. In a programming language, you have data types. What it does is it fixes different types or pieces of data that map to certain types of data. So you have strings, you have numbers, you have big numbers, small numbers, you have dates. It's automatic formatting of data that Oracle and the language will handle for you. The quantities and scale of the errors you can get in a programming language that does not have strict data typing, such as Perl, can cause you real big headaches because you're constantly resolving data type issues all the time. Data types are critical to efficient production of programming code. A variable is a box that you put a value into and you pass it on to something. It can vary, it can change. It is basically a data type bucket that you can put something into and pass into something else. And like a parameter, when you pass a parameter into a function, you create the function with a variable name that's passed into the function or the name procedure, and you put a value in there. So the parameter is a variable as well. But you use variables in programming all the time to change the way that code behaves and to create generic code so that you get a lot less coding into an application than you would if you didn't have variables. Critical to programming. Programming controls are basically special statements that allow you to change the way that a program is going to behave. You can control the program. And very briefly, we've discussed these already. Programming control statements, which we will look at shortly, are including if then else, case statements, different types of loop. A while loop in programming is a loop that tests at the beginning of the loop, so it may not execute at all. An until loop technically tests at the end of the loop, so the loop will always execute at least once. A for loop is a loop that executes for something to something, and you can have a loop statement. PL SQL and some programming languages allow goto statements, but you can create a big mess with them because it tends to bounce out of this nice logical modular structure created by all these sensible statements, programming control statements.